A new cholera outbreak in Yemen has killed more than 180 people. Those are the numbers since April 27th, according to the International Committee for the Red Cross, which reports another 11,000 suspected cholera cases nationwide. Sanaa's Houthi government declared a state of emergency late Sunday, May 14th. Thousands of Yemenis have died amid 2 years of conflict, which has decimated public infrastructure in the country. Meanwhile, cholera is most likely to spread in places with poor water treatment and sanitation. The World Health Organization says cholera is an acute diarrheal infection. Without IV fluids and antibiotics, severe cases can kill within hours. On Monday, the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Yemen tweeted, quote, "IV fluid everywhere in hospitals, sometimes in cars parked outside health centers." This is Yemen's second cholera outbreak in less than a year. For United News International, I'm Matt Paul.
In a statement on Tuesday, South Korea's defense minister expressed concerns that North Korea's missile program is progressing faster than expected, following yet another test launch. The UN has since condemned the Sunday launch after demanding on Monday that Pyongyang halt all nuclear and ballistic missile tests. However, the reclusive North, which has defied all calls to rein in its weapons programs, have claimed the missile test was a legitimate act of self-defense against U.S. hostility. Defense Minister Han Min-koo told South Korea's parliament the test launch had been detected by the controversial U.S. THAAD anti-missile system, whose deployment in the South has increased tensions between the U.S. and China.
The Philippine government could buy up to $500 million worth of military hardware from China. Philippine Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana on May 14 stated the Chinese government has offered a $500 million loan to the Philippines for use to buy defense equipment. At a Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, Philippine Star says President Rodrigo Duterte is believed to have spoken with Chinese arms manufacturer Poly Technologies. Currently, the Philippine letter of intent for the arms purchases is non-binding, and the country has not decided what hardware it wants to purchase. On May 15, President Duterte met with China's Premier Li Keqiang to discuss cooperation between the two countries. Previously, the Philippines has purchased military hardware from the United States, but recently, U.S. conditions tied to sales have caused the Philippines to look at other options. For United News International from Metro Manila, I'm Crystal Yap.
Reuters has reported that the United States said on Tuesday it believed it could persuade China to impose new UN sanctions on North Korea following its latest ballistic missile test, and warned that Washington would also target and, quote, call out countries supporting Pyongyang. Speaking to reporters ahead of a closed-door UN Security Council meeting on the missile launch, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley also made clear that Washington would only talk to North Korea once it halted its nuclear program. North Korea fired a ballistic missile on Sunday that landed in the sea near Russia, which experts said signaled major advances in developing an intercontinental ballistic missile that could target the United States.
Recent violence in Venezuela has reportedly left 3 people dead in demonstrations across the country. Hundreds of thousands of protesters have flooded the streets for weeks, seeking to end the country's economic and political crisis. On Monday, May 15th, demonstrators again took to the streets nationwide, this time to stage sit-ins and block roads to pressure President Nicolas Maduro to hold elections. Some of the demonstrations turned violent. According to officials in Táchira State, 18-year-old Luis Alvarez and 33-year-old Diego Hernandez were killed in clashes with security forces on Monday. The Associated Press reported a 17-year-old in Barinas State was shot in the head Tuesday as well. The violence has left more than 36 people dead since widespread demonstrations started nearly 7 weeks ago. But Maduro's government has not yielded to the protests and is instead set to convene a special assembly to rewrite the country's constitution. For United News International, I'm Cabri Caldwell.
The talks are set against a toxic backdrop. Both sides have turned up, but the difference is so great, it's not possible, says the UN's Syria envoy Staffan de Mistura, for them to be in the same room. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has denounced the talks as nothing, and the United States, although not a participant, has raised tensions further by accusing the Syrian leader of industrial levels of killings at a prison near the capital, Damascus. The US State Department said the Syrian government had even built a crematorium to cover up the thousands of deaths at the prison, a claim denied by Damascus. The UN-mediated talks here in Geneva focus on issues of governance, elections, the constitution and counter-terrorism. In reality, both sides fixated with what should happen to Bashar al-Assad in the event of any agreement. He's staying put, according to backers in Iran and Russia, but is seen as unacceptable by the rebel opposition, the US and the European Union. Further, the talks are now also tracked by a parallel peace plan, the Astana Agreement, endorsed by Russia, Iran and Turkey. The talks here are scheduled to continue until Friday. Richard Bestick, CGTN at the UN, Geneva.
The Associated Press has reported that New Orleans announced late on Tuesday that it had begun the process of removing a statue of Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. This is the third of 4 monuments city officials plan to take down across the city. In a news release, Mayor Mitch Landrieu said, "While we must honor our history, we will not allow the Confederacy to be put on a pedestal in the heart of New Orleans." Landrieu called for the monument's removal in the lingering emotional aftermath of the 2015 massacre of 9 black parishioners at a South Carolina church.
Outside the federal courthouse in Seattle, a handful of demonstrators protested. Inside, a 3-judge panel heard arguments for and against President Donald Trump's travel ban.
How is a court to know if, in fact, it's a Muslim ban in the guise of national security justification?
Judge Gould, I think that's the nub of the case.
The people, united, will never be divided.
The Trump administration's attorney urged the court to disregard promises Trump made during the election campaign about a total ban on Muslim visitors, and statements by surrogates saying the executive order was aimed at Muslims.
Over time, the president clarified that what he was talking about were Islamic terrorist groups and the countries that shelter or sponsor them. And over time, he and his advisors clarified that what he was focused on were groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
The focus, he said, should be on the language of the order itself.
The order on its face doesn't have anything to do with religion, and in operation doesn't distinguish on the basis of religion.
But the attorney arguing against the ban said Trump's statements before and after he became president gave ample evidence the ban was intended to discriminate on religious grounds, which is illegal under the U.S. Constitution.
We're not saying that we're not in favor of psychoanalysis or trying to get into the president's head. You don't, Your Honor, need to be Sigmund Freud in order to affirm the district court. You just simply must ask, as the Supreme Court has told you, what would an objective observer think with these sorts of statements?
Trump's ban has been blocked repeatedly by federal courts, but his spokesman said the White House would ultimately prevail.
The executive order is fully lawful and will be upheld.
The Attorney General of Hawaii said the order harkened back to times in U.S. history that should never be repeated.
There's a way to go about protecting our borders. There's a way to protect our national security in a way that doesn't violate the Constitution, that doesn't discriminate against people based upon their nation of origin or based upon their religion.
Legal experts say it'll likely be at least several days before the judges here reach a decision. And whatever they decide, there's a very good chance that the Trump travel ban will wind up being argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Seattle.
North Korea hackers already stand accused of disrupting South Korean power plants, ruining Sony Pictures computers, and stealing $81 million from Bangladesh's central bank. But if they also caused this past week's global cyber meltdown, the regime's cyber operatives may have finally gone too far. That's because the spreading malware crisis hardest hit victims include China, the country that some cybersecurity experts say has enabled North Korea's hacking operations by providing network bandwidth. Further, experts are suggesting China gave physical space for thousands of Pyongyang hackers to launch attacks on government and corporate computer systems around the world.
9 people were injured during a protest outside of the residence of the Turkish ambassador to the U.S. in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. About 12 people showed up to the embassy a few hours after Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met with President Donald Trump at the White House, where Trump extended a warm welcome to authoritarian-style leader Erdogan. One protester said, "They think they can engage in the same sort of suppression of protest and free speech that they engage in Turkey. They stopped us for a few minutes, but we still stayed and continued to protest Erdogan's tyrannical regime." A Facebook video captured at the scene shows several protesters covered in blood.
South Korea and the United States have agreed to work towards finding ways to achieve the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Young Yu-chan, the press secretary for South Korean President Moon Jae-in, said on Tuesday that the two countries will seek new and practical ways to rid Pyongyang of its nuclear weapons. They agreed to investigate all avenues, including sanctions and dialogue. Yoon also said the two countries plan to hold a leaders' summit in Washington in June.
They fled heavy fighting in Raqqa in search of safety and have come to this camp called Ain Issa. Now they're facing a new obstacle. Waiting in long queues to retrieve their identity documents, people living here say they are stuck because when they arrived, their documents were taken by camp officials for processing.
We need to work. I have a 20-member family. We are not going to stay here. There is no food or water. We are hungry.
I've been running from ISIL for a week now. My family does not know whether I'm alive or not. I need to go and look for them.
The Syrian Democratic Forces, a group of Arab and mainly Kurdish YPG fighters backed by the US, are closing in on the ISIL stronghold of Raqqa. The fighting has forced many from their homes. 20,000 people have arrived at this camp in recent days. The influx of refugees is causing problems for administrators in the camp.
The problem is the camp committee consists of 20 people. What can 20 officials do for 20,000 displaced people? They have to stay organized and wait in queues. Sometimes you feel suffocated.
When the displaced Syrians finally make it to this room, they have to dig through thousands of documents, hoping to find their own. Once they do, they hope to be on the move again in search of a more permanent place to call home. The advance by the Syrian Democratic Forces towards Raqqa with the help of coalition airstrikes and US weapons has accelerated in recent days. Now the SDF says it plans on launching a full-scale military operation on the ISIL stronghold in the coming weeks. And the UN says it expects as many as 500,000 people could be forced to flee the area. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, Gaziantep.
The Trump administration is expanding an anti-abortion foreign aid policy. It's a so-called global gag rule, and it bans U.S. dollars from international health groups that perform abortions or provide abortion information. The U.S. State Department announced the changes May 15th. Now, any foreign organization that seeks American money for any of its health programs, from AIDS treatment to malaria prevention to reproductive health services, must promise not to, quote, promote abortion as a method of family planning. Past versions of the ban specifically targeted international family planning groups. The policy will affect roughly $8.8 billion in funding for international health programs. The State Department promised that the policy would not reduce the overall level of foreign aid. Funds allotted to any groups that do not agree to the new terms will be redistributed to organizations that do. For United News International, I'm Camry Caldwell.
U.S. Ambassador to Israel.
Ambassador David Friedman is a lawyer who once helped Donald Trump out of a financial jam involving some bankrupt casinos Trump owned in New Jersey. He's also an ardent Zionist who has raised millions of dollars as head of American Friends of Beit El, a Jewish settlement built on Palestinian-owned land close to Ramallah.
The support is very important for us because it gives the international legitimacy and international feeling that what we are doing here is important.
Friedman has given so much money to Bet El over the years that his name can be found all over the settlement, marking the walls of its religious schools and other institutions, like this one.
But while the building has Friedman's name on it, the property actually belongs to this man, Dia Abdel Fattah, from the Palestinian town of Dur al-Qara.
For 50 years I've not used my land.
Even though there were grapevines, figs, and fruit trees, they built on top of it.
Abdel Fattah can see Beit El from his balcony, but like all other Palestinian people living under Israeli occupation, he's forbidden to set foot in it.
This land belongs to me, to my children's and my grandchildren's. I inherited it from my father. It would cause pain for anyone if someone takes over your land. It hurts.
Dur el-Qara's mayor, Bassem Qassem, displayed maps of the town and the adjacent Jewish settlement. He says documents dating back to Ottoman times show that Beit El's land belongs to people in Dur el-Qara. And he thinks Friedman is a poor choice for ambassador.
This will reflect negatively on the US. It isn't constructive for the relationship between the American people and the Arab people.
But Beit El settlers say Palestinians never really owned the land at all.
The Jewish people believe that all of the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people and was promised to them in the Bible.
Beit El's council has big plans to expand the settlement from 6,000 to 10,000 residents over the next 5 years. And with wealthy and well-connected Zionists like David Friedman behind them, there's little to stand in their way. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Beit El in the occupied West Bank. Outside the federal courthouse in Seattle, a handful of demonstrators protested. Inside, a 3-judge panel heard arguments for and against President Donald Trump's travel ban.
How is a court to know if, in fact, it's a Muslim ban in the guise of national security justification?
Judge Gould, I think that's the nub of the case.
The people, united, will never be divided.
The Trump administration's attorney urged the court to disregard promises Trump made during the election campaign about a total ban on Muslim visitors and statements by surrogates saying the executive order was aimed at Muslims.
Over time, the president clarified that what he was talking about were Islamic terrorist groups and the countries that shelter or sponsor them. And over time, he and his advisors clarified that what he was focused on were groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
The focus, he said, should be on the language of the order itself.
The order on its face doesn't have anything to do with religion, and in operation doesn't distinguish on the basis of religion.
But the attorney arguing against the ban said Trump's statements before and after he became president gave ample evidence the ban was intended to discriminate on religious grounds, which is illegal under the U.S. Constitution.
We're not saying that we're not in favor of psychoanalysis or trying to get into the president's head. You don't, Your Honor, need to be Sigmund Freud in order to affirm the district court. You just simply must ask, as the Supreme Court has told you, what would an objective observer think with these sorts of statements?
Trump's ban has been blocked repeatedly by federal courts, but his spokesman said the White House would ultimately prevail.
The executive order is fully lawful and will be upheld.
The Attorney General of Hawaii said the order harkened back to times in U.S. history that should never be repeated.
There's a way to go about protecting our borders. There's a way to protect our national security in a way that doesn't violate the Constitution, that doesn't discriminate against people based upon their nation of origin or based upon their religion.
Legal experts say it'll likely be at least several days before the judges here reach a decision. And whatever they decide, there's a very good chance that the Trump travel ban will wind up being argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Seattle.
In South Korea, where its ruling Democratic Party has put forward the possibility of returning the THAAD anti-missile system to the United States, National Assembly member Woo Won-shik said in a radio interview that the deployment of THAAD required parliamentary approval. He added that if there were any legal issues related to this deployment, the Democratic Party would recommend returning the system to the U.S. In July 2016, Washington and Seoul agreed to deploy THAAD in South Korea, with the procedure beginning in March this year. Several neighboring nations have been strongly opposed to its deployment, including China and Russia.